Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are tackling a foundational discipline, one that, well, everyone has an opinion on, but very few people actually understand its history. Political science.
Or is it political sciences?
Right. Or maybe we should call it politology.
And that confusion right out of the gate is the perfect way to start. We're diving into the really turbulent journey of this academic field.
A journey that our core source material describes in pretty stark terms. It calls the discipline ill-defined, amorphous, and heterogeneous.
It's a fantastic description. It's a field that has spent centuries, literally, fighting to establish its own identity, to carve out its own space, separate from history, from law, from philosophy.
So that's our mission today. We're going to unpack that evolution, the big institutional milestones, the constant confusing name changes, and the sheer bureaucratic struggle it took to formalize the study of power.
And we're drawing on a lot of academic perspectives here, especially work that tracks this path to autonomy, both internationally and in a really interesting case study in Poland.
What's so amazing to me is that this isn't just a dry story about academic departments. It's a high-stakes story of survival.
Absolutely. Think about the ideological pressures, especially in the Eastern Bloc after World War II.
Yeah.
We're talking about a discipline that was literally liquidated, just wiped off the books and replaced by compulsory state doctrine.
Exactly. So for you listening, this is your guide to understanding the actual structure and the boundaries of this field that's all about governance and human political behavior.
And the key insight, really, the thread we'll follow, is this. The story of political science is a story of constant renaming, constant redefinition, and a deep, deep need for what we call hybridization. It's this perpetual search for a scientific self.
So where do we even begin with a story that's sprawling?
You have to start with the chaos of the name, because what you call a discipline isn't just a label. It defines its entire legal and institutional place in the world.
Okay, let's unpack that, starting with a really recent, really concrete example. The Polish academic system just went through this massive overhaul.
A tectonic shift. It happened on October 1st, 2018. A regulation from the Minister of Science and Higher Education just completely redrew the academic map.
And the discipline we're talking about,
Oh.
it got a new name.
It did. The old discipline was called Nauki o polityce, which translates to Sciences of Politics, plural.
Plural, okay.
That was officially renamed to Nauki o polityce administracji.
Which is Sciences of Politics and Administration.
Exactly. And that addition, the mandatory inclusion of administration, that's the bureaucratic tell. It signals a huge expansion of the discipline's territory.
It sounds like it's moving away from just pure political theory. I heard they even considered a longer name at first.
They did, yeah. The first draft, the one that was ultimately rejected, was Nauki o polityce administracji o polityce publicznych.
Politics, administration, and public policy. That's a mouthful.
It is. But even the shortened version shows the clear intention.
Yeah.
It wanted to create this huge integrated discipline that covers everything from high theory all the way down to, the day-to-day execution of policy.
So what did this new mega discipline actually swallow up? What was absorbed into it?
It was a pretty significant merger, and it reflects this global trend toward, let's call it functional overlap.
Getting rid of silos.
Right. So first, it absorbed the original sciences of politics. Then it took in public policy, which was completely liquidated as its own separate thing, just rolled right in.
Okay.
It also absorbed administration, but specifically excluding administrative law that got sent elsewhere.
And the most surprising part?
The most surprising part was that it also absorbed Nauki o zarządzaniu, which is management. And what's wild is that management had previously been classified under the domain of the humanities.
Wait, management from the humanities into a social science discipline?
Yes. And it speaks volumes about this shifting identity. It's a move away from the philosophical and historical, and a doubling down on being an empirical social science focused on how systems actually work.
It connects everything back to the practical act of governance?
Precisely. If you're studying public policy and administration, you are, at a fundamental level, studying management. The management of people, of resources, of institutions, all within the state's framework. It's a calculated institutional move to capture the entire territory of governance studies.
That makes so much sense of a dense bureaucratic name. But that's just Poland. Globally, we still have this fight, right? The single versus the plural. Political sciences versus political science.
We do. And the history there is revealing. The plural, political sciences, was the original term, especially in France and the Anglo-Saxon countries.
Why plural?
Because it wasn't one unified field. It was an umbrella. You had political economy, political philosophy, political history, political sociology. All of these different disciplines started poking at political questions from their own angles. The plural just acknowledged that it was a loose cluster of related inquiries.
So the plural describes the fragmented reality and the singular that describes the ambition.
That is the perfect way to put it. The transition to the singular political science, which has really dominated the Anglo-Saxon world for the last few decades, was a huge symbolic move.
It was a declaration of intent.
It was. It was a claim to methodological unity, a pursuit of a single scientific identity. It was borrowing, frankly, from the prestige of the natural sciences. We are one science.
Let's talk about the other big term, politology. You hear it all the time, but almost never in the US or the UK.
Right. Politology is derived from Greek polis and logos. It became really widespread in Poland from the 1990s onward. But its real heartland, its greatest currency, is in the former Eastern Bloc countries.
Right.
Russia, Ukraine, the Czech Republic.
Why there specifically?
It's the preferred term when they're translating their study programs or their university departments. It just became the accepted academic language in that post-Soviet sphere. I think it might be a way of creating some distance.
Distance from what?
From the very American behavioralist tradition that's so tied up in the name political science. Using the Greek root, probitology, maybe lets you anchor the field more in the older, broader, more philosophical European tradition, rather than the heavily quantitative American one.
It's a signal of a different intellectual heritage.
I think so. But even some major Anglo-Saxon scholars have used it, which shows how universal this identity crisis really is.
Like who?
Our source points to Philip C. Schmitter, a hugely influential American political scientist. He published a piece titled Politics as a Science, aka politology.
So he's acknowledging it right there in the title.
He goes further. He uses the term politicology and calls practitioners politologists. That's a clear nod from the very heart of Anglo-Saxon academia to this global diversity in naming.
And all this confusion is mirrored in how the universities themselves named their departments before things got standardized.
Oh, it was a total mess. If you want to study politics at an Ivy League school in the early 20th century, good luck finding a political science department.
So what would you find?
At Harvard, you'd look for the Department of Government. At Princeton, it was just politics. Columbia, which actually had the first graduate school of political science, still called its department Public Law and Government.
It just shows that the consensus, even at the highest level, took a very, very long time to form.
An incredibly long time. The discipline is still in motion, still being defined and redefined by these institutional choices.
Okay, we've established the naming chaos. Let's trace the actual birth of the modern discipline. The consensus says it formally separated in the second half of the 19th century.
That's the consensus for the scientific separation, yes. Meaning, when it established itself as a standalone empirical field of study. For that to happen, the institutional infrastructure had to be built first.
And the U.S. moved really fast on that front.
Very fast. The first real move was at Johns Hopkins in 1877, where they created a historical, politological, scientific society. A nice start.
But the big one was at Columbia.
The big one was 1880. John W. Burgess founds the Graduate School of Political Science at Columbia University. That was the game changer. It created a centralized, dedicated home for advanced study.
An institutional anchor. But to be a real discipline, you need a professional community.
And that is the crucial turning point. The formation of the American Political Science Association, APSA, in 1903. That's when the community of scholars was formalized.
And they needed a way to talk to each other.
So in 1906, they launched their journal, the American Political Science Review, which is still hugely influential. Those two things, the association and the journal, gave the discipline its standard bearer, its voice, and its professional stamp of approval.
Now let's jump across the Atlantic to Europe. In the UK, the institutions were there early, but the adoption was slower.
It's a fascinating story. The brand name was established early. You get the London School of Economics and Political Science, the LSE, in 1895. Oxford gets its first chair of politology in 1912.
So the buildings were there.
The buildings were there, the titles were there, but modern politology, the empirical, systematic, often quantitative research that defines the field today, that didn't really start to flourish in the UK until the second half of the 1960s.
That's decades after the behavioral revolution started in the US. Why the lag?
The British academic tradition was just so deeply rooted in political philosophy, in history, in jurisprudence. There was a sort of cultural resistance to the specifically the creation of the Social Science Research Council. It provided the funding and the validation for this kind of rigorous, non-philosophical social science. Money talks.
And what about France? They had the famous Sciences Po schools.
They did. The École Libre des Sciences Politiques was founded in 1872, so it actually predates the big American institutions. But, and this is a huge but, its original focus was highly practical.
How so?
It was designed to train the national elite civil servants diplomats. It was essentially a training academy for the machinery of government.
So the formal recognition of political science as a research discipline came later.
Much later. It really only happened after the devastation of World War II. The shock of the war seemed to create a demand for a more scientific understanding of politics.
And that's when you get the key French institutions?
That's when you get the Fondation Nationale des Sciences Politiques and the launch of the really authoritative Revue Française des Sciences Politiques in 1951. That's the moment the research function finally separated from the purely vocational training function.
This timeline seems pretty clear, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but there's a huge, surprising outlier, the Swedish claim.
The Swedish claim is remarkable. It pushes the whole timeline back by centuries. They cite the creation of the first chair dedicated to issues of governance at Uppsala University in 1622.
1622, how is that even possible? What were they teaching?
That's the critical question. They were teaching the study of governance for sure, but it was rooted in the classical tradition, rhetoric, ethics, the nature of the state, drawing on Aristotle. It was political philosophy and statecraft.
So it was the study of the subject, but not the modern scientific method.
Exactly. Uppsala represents the philosophical cradle, whereas the 19th century movements represent the scientific cradle. But it's an incredible legacy, and it's honored today by the prestigious Skype Prize, which is sometimes called the Nobel Prize of Political Science.
It's amazing that despite these early starts, the global march to autonomy was just so slow.
Incredibly slow. And the best way to see that is to look at the founding dates of the National Professional Associations.
Let's run through them.
Okay, you have the U.S. in 1903, Canada 1913, Finland 1935, then a big gap and a cluster after World War II. France in 49, the UK in 50.
But then it slows down again.
Massively. A major European country like Italy didn't establish its National Political Science Association until 1981.
1981.
It's shocking. It shows that for most of the world, for most of the 20th century, political science was still submerged inside other departments, usually law or history.
But once that professionalization started happening, international cooperation wasn't far behind.
No, the post-war period was crucial for that. The founding of the International Political Science Association, IPSA, in 1949, under the umbrella of UNESCO, was a huge step.
And Poland joined pretty early, didn't they?
Remarkably early. In 1950, despite the Iron Curtain rapidly falling, they managed to get in. And then you have the key regional bodies like the European Consortium for Political Research, the ECPR, from 1970, which did so much to standardize research methods across Europe.
So even with all this global diffusion, when you look at the landscape today, the Anglo-Saxon countries, and especially the U.S., still hold a dominant position.
They absolutely do. In terms of research output, publications, citations, they really set the standard. Our source does note that this dominance is declining slightly as European and Asian universities rise, but it's still the hegemonic force.
The global university rankings tell that story pretty clearly.
They do. If you look at the 2020 Shanghai ranking for political science, the top 15 spots were all occupied by US and UK universities. Harvard at number 1, LSE at number 4, Oxford at 11.
And that creates a powerful feedback loop.
A very powerful one. The high rankings attract the best talent and the most funding, which just reinforces the methodological standards that those institutions promote globally.
Okay, that global context really sets the stage for the specific and, as you said, highly volatile history of politology in Poland, which actually has these surprisingly deep roots.
The Polish institutional origins are, well, they're ancient. In some ways, they rival that Swedish claim. The very first chair of politics was established at the Vilnius Academy sometime after 1674.
That's incredible.
And then you get even more definitive milestones. A chair of political skills in Lviv in 1784, and one at the prestigious Jagiellonian University in 1801.
Let's put that in perspective. 1801 predates the American Political Science Association by over 100 years.
A full century. These early chairs were very practical, focused on statecraft law and Enlightenment ideas about good governance. But all of that history, all of that tradition just came to a screeching halt after World War II.
And this is where the story gets really dramatic.
It becomes a story of institutional death and then eventually revival. After the war, political sciences were immediately and totally subordinated to communist ideology. The state actively dismantled the entire academic infrastructure.
What specifically happened in the 1950s?
The academies that existed in Warsaw and Krakow were just shut down. Political science education as an independent field was, for all intents and purposes, liquidated across the country.
And it was replaced by?
It was replaced by a compulsory ideological subject called Foundations of Marxism-Leninism, which every student had to take until 1955.
So the study of politics was replaced by political doctrine. What happened to the scholars?
They had to flee. Academically speaking, they had to migrate into adjacent, safer disciplines, mostly history, law, or sociology, just to survive. For over a decade, politology as a distinct field simply ceased to exist in Poland.
The source mentions an interesting detail, though. Poland didn't teach scientific communism.
That's right. Along with Yugoslavia, it was one of the only Eastern Bloc states that avoided it. While Foundations of Marxism-Leninism was rigid, it wasn't as dogmatic and abstract as scientific communism, which might have, in a subtle way, made the revival a little bit easier when the time came.
And that turning point was the political thaw of October 1956.
That was the moment. After 1956, activity could resume. And the hard work of not just rebuilding, but re-legitimizing the entire field began.
What were the first signs of that revival?
The first step is always professional organization. The Polish Political Science Association was founded in 1957. Then came the curriculum. A subject called Foundations of Political Sciences was introduced in the early 60s.
And then came the dedicated institutes.
By the late 60s, you start to see political science institutes forming in the major cities, Krakow, Poznan, Warsaw. And then in the 70s, it gets the ultimate seal of approval. The Polish Academy of Sciences created its own Committee of Political Sciences in 1972.
That's a statement of serious intent.
It is. It places the discipline among the established sciences.
Yeah.
And then they launched 5-year master's programs, creating a pipeline for a new generation of scholars.
Then we get to the huge systemic transformation of 1990. The source says this led to a crisis, but then a massive boom. How does a crisis lead to a boom?
The crisis happened first because the discipline had been so tied to the old communist state. Some of the institutes that were basically just training grounds for party functionaries were liquidated. But that crisis gave way very quickly to what our source calls the fashion era of the mid-90s and 2000s.
A fashion for studying politology. Why?
Because of freedom. Suddenly, Poland had a multi-party system, a free press, and the huge, exciting prospect of joining the European Union and NATO. Young people flocked to these fields, politology, international relations, European studies, because they represented modernity, the West, and new careers in diplomacy, in public administration, in this new democratic world.
Which explains the absolutely staggering student numbers.
The scale is almost unbelievable. In the 1989-90 academic year, there were about 3,500 politology students.
Okay.
By the 2004-05 academic year, that number peaked at a record 55,674 students.
55,000 in one field.
It's mind-boggling. The source calculates that for a period in the early 2000s, almost 1 in every 30 students graduating in Poland had a degree in politology.
That kind of demand must have fueled massive institutional growth.
It did. But the question is always about quality. Did the academic side keep pace? And the evidence says yes. The number of doctorates awarded each year went from 28 in 2000 to 155 in 2010.
A huge increase.
And even more importantly, the number of habilitations, which is the postdoctoral degree you need to become a full professor in that system, went from just 3 in 2000 to 33 in 2012. The academic core really strengthened.
So even though the student numbers eventually came down after that initial boom, the professional core of Polish politology today is strong and internationally recognized.
Yes. They're hosting major international conferences. Their top universities are appearing in global rankings. The conclusion from the source is clear. Despite all the turbulence, Polish politology is definitively not a peripheral player on the world stage.
Which brings us back full circle to the core problem we started with, the struggle for a clear definition.
It's the central mystery of the discipline. Most textbooks, both Polish and Western, don't even try to offer a direct definition. They define the scope of the field, what it studies, but they shy away from saying what it is.
Which is why we get that great 1975 description from Greenstein and Polsby. Ill-defined, amorphous, and heterogeneous. It's a science that just resists being pinned down.
And that's because of the interplay of two powerful forces, specialization and hybridization.
Okay, break those down for us.
The modern field has intense specialization. Scholars become hyper-focused on, say, the electoral system of Belgium or the psychology of populist leaders. This naturally leads to the fragmentation of the discipline into dozens of subfields.
And if that's all that happened, it would just fly apart.
It would. So to stop that from happening, the field relies on hybridization.
This crossing fertilization, as the source calls it, how does that work in practice?
It's the conscious act of borrowing concepts, methods, and theories from neighboring disciplines to build analytical bridges.
Give me an example.
The best example is rational choice theory from economics. Applying that model of human behavior, that people are rational actors trying to maximize their utility, fundamentally changed how political scientists study voting, how they study legislative bargaining, how they study international conflict. It provided a kind of mathematical rigor that politology initially lacked.
So instead of just looking at party loyalty, you start calculating strategic decisions.
Exactly. Or think about psychology. The whole subfield of political psychology borrows frameworks on cognitive bias and group dynamics to understand why people are susceptible to political advertising, or how leaders cultivate charisma. The advancement of the social sciences absolutely depends on this strategic borrowing.
Which explains why the definition itself has had to change so much over time. The old historical definitions must seem really narrow now.
They do. In the 19th century, the definition was very simple. Political science is the study of the state and its formal institutions. If it wasn't part of the formal government, it wasn't considered politics.
But the modern definition is so much broader.
It expanded massively in the mid-20th century. Now it's defined as the study of governments, political processes, institutions, and, most critically, political behavior. It wants to understand the political actions of individuals, groups, elites, the whole system.
But at its absolute core, it's about two things: politics and power.
Yes. The simplest definition is that it's the science dealing with politics. And politics is understood as everything related to striving for, exercising, and maintaining power.
This is where you get those really stark realist views.
This is where you get Hans J. Morgenthau, the great theorist of international relations, who famously said, "All politics is a struggle for power." A very conflict-centered view.
But there are other views, right? It's not all about struggle.
No, and it's crucial to remember the counter-definitions. You have scholars who define politics in terms of conciliation and problem-solving. As the activity, negotiation, discussion, persuasion, that results in an issue being settled. That view is much more relevant for studying how complex democracies actually function day to day.
So beyond just describing all this, what is the field supposed to do? What are its goals?
Like any science, it has three basic functions. 1, descriptive observe and categorize reality. 2, explanatory figure out causal relationships, build theories. And 3, prognostic try to predict and maybe even shape the future.
But the goals are often seen as much grander than that. This brings us to that powerful analogy from Carl W. Deutsch.
The grand analogy. It's so important for understanding how the discipline sees itself. Deutsch argued that politology should be treated as a branch of medicine.
Medicine for the state.
Exactly. Its goal isn't just to observe the political body. It's to understand politics and work for its good, to relieve suffering and prevent death within that body politic.
That's a huge shift. It turns the political scientist from a detached observer into a societal diagnostician.
It implies a moral and a practical imperative. If a democracy is sick, if it's suffering from extreme polarization or institutional collapse, the political scientist's job is to diagnose the cause and prescribe a treatment based on empirical evidence, just like a physician.
So it can never fully escape those big fundamental philosophical questions.
It can't. It always has to ask, what is a good state? What are the fundamental laws of human political behavior? It's that philosophical anchor that stops the discipline from just becoming technical data analysis. It has to be the intellectual backbone for society.
The journey to becoming that backbone was tied to these big shifts in methodology. Let's talk about the three dominant research approaches that have defined the field.
Yes, the traditional, the behavioral, and the post-behavioral schools. Understanding these is understanding the discipline's entire intellectual evolution.
So start with the traditional approach.
The traditional school dominated until the middle of the 20th century. It was historical, it was legal, it was institutional, and most of all, it was normative. It wanted to understand how the state and its institutions ought to function, based on philosophy and law.
Its weakness was that it ignored how people actually behaved.
Precisely. It was focused on the formal rules, the Constitution, not the messy reality of human action. And that's what the behavioral revolution rejected completely.
This was the big American-led movement.
It was a true revolution, starting in the 1930s and 40s. The behavioralists said, if this is going to be a science, it has to be strictly empirical. No more ought, only is.
So they shifted the focus.
They shifted the focus entirely, from formal institutions to the actual observable behavior of individuals and groups. They stopped asking, what is the constitutional power of a legislator? And started asking, how do legislators actually vote and why? They brought in surveys, statistics, quantifiable data.
And that's what finally gave the discipline its claim to scientific autonomy.
That was the definitive break. It gave the field its own distinct methodology, finally separating it from history and law. It's what justified the singular name, political science.
But pure behaviorism had its own problems, which led to the post-behavioral movement.
It did. Critics argued that in its obsession with scientific purity, behaviorism started focusing on trivial things that were easy to count, while ignoring the huge, value-laden issues like war or justice or tyranny.
Because you can't easily quantify them.
Exactly. So the post-behavioral approach, which emerged in the late 60s, sought a synthesis. It said, facts and values are connected. We need to use the quantitative data from the behaviorists, but we also need the qualitative insights and historical context from the traditionalists. We need to study both institutions and behavior.
And that synthesis is basically where the field is today, this broad, hybridized structure.
Yes. And back in 1948, a UNESCO conference tried to map it out. They defined 4 foundational areas that are still the backbone of the discipline today. 1, general political theory. 2, political institutions. 3, parties, groups, and public opinion. And 4, international relations.
And we see the subdisciplines just exploding from there with all the borrowing we talked about.
All the borrowing. You get hybrids like political marketing, which uses commercial advertising techniques, political geography, which blends spatial analysis with power, psychology of politics, which uses cognitive models. This constant absorption is what keeps the field alive and relevant.
Let's make this more concrete for our listeners. Let's connect some of these big research areas to the key thinkers the source material mentions.
Great idea. So on the macro level, you have scholars looking at huge systemic questions, like political change. You have Samuel Huntington, who famously argued that rapid social change without strong institutions to manage it leads to chaos and revolution.
Or the study of non-democratic systems.
Right. The foundational work on totalitarianism and authoritarianism by people like Hannah Arendt or Zbigniew Brzezinski, they gave us the language to understand regimes that seek total control over society.
And then on the more micro level, within democracies,
You have the massive field of political culture, pioneered by Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba. Their work showed what kinds of beliefs and attitudes are necessary for a stable democracy to thrive. Then you have deep dives into electoral behavior by people like Paul Lazarsfeld, mapping how and why voters make their choices.
what about the inner workings of government, the power games?
That's where you get coalition theories, which often use game theory to predict which political parties will form a government together. And then the work by scholars like Robert Dahl and Aaron Lichfart, who compared different models of democracy, trying to figure out which systems are more stable or more fair.
And that's not even touching international relations.
Which is a whole world in itself. You have theories of war and peace from Raymond Aron, the concept of the balance of power from Morgenthau. The breadth is just incredible. It's why it's so hard to define, but also why it's so vital.
Okay, we've covered the huge scope of the discipline, but we have to be honest about its limits. The source is very clear about the inherent barriers to political inquiry.
It is. And these barriers all stem from the simple fact that we're studying humans in complex, uncontrollable environments. The first challenge is just sheer complexity. We're analyzing macro-scale systems, states, global economies, where the number of variables is practically infinite.
And we're usually studying things as they happen, so the facts themselves are often in dispute.
Exactly. But the biggest barrier, the one that really separates it from the hard sciences, is the problem of limited experimentation.
You can't rerun an election with one variable change to see what happens.
You can't. You can't ethically or practically run a true controlled experiment at the level of a state. This non-repeatability makes it incredibly difficult to formulate general predictive laws about politics. We can identify patterns, but universal laws are pretty much out of reach.
And then there's the human factor, the problem of the researcher's own bias.
It's the greatest internal struggle. We call it maintaining cognitive distance. Researchers are people. They live in the systems they study. They have political beliefs. They have values. Trying to remain objective is a constant, difficult task.
And that vulnerability opens the door to the biggest shadow that hangs over the discipline: ideology.
We saw the extreme version of it in post-war Poland, where the entire field was swallowed by communist ideology. But the challenge never goes away. It just changes shape. Whether it's research funding pushing certain conclusions or a scholar's own commitments coloring their analysis, the fight for objectivity is never over.
So after this long, complicated journey, we come back to where we started. Politology is a discipline that is still searching for its own identity.
It is. It's in a state of what you might call perpetual but highly effective adolescence. And now it's facing these new pressures from globalization university rankings, the demand for standardized metrics that are forcing it to conform to a global, often Anglo-Saxon model.
But the ultimate pressure, the final imperative, is a practical one.
It is. The modern discipline has to use all this vast hybrid knowledge to solve real-world problems.
Yeah.
It's not just an academic game. It's meant to be the intellectual expert support system for society.
For example, diagnosing the current crisis of representative democracy.
That's the perfect example. Politology has to be able to analyze what's going wrong, the institutional gridlock, the rise of populism, the collapse of trust, and then, based on evidence and comparative analysis, warn against bad decisions and suggest potential solutions.
It brings us right back to Deutsch's medical analogy.
It does. The discipline exists to diagnose and treat the political body. And if it can't offer effective responses to a sickness like democratic erosion, then its claim to scientific utility really starts to fade.
We have completed our deep dive into the incredible journey of political science toward its own autonomy. We've charted this history from the old philosophical traditions all the way to the institutional battles of the 20th century.
And what we've seen is that the struggle is really defined by two constant forces. One, the fight for a clear, stable name. And two, the absolute necessity of borrowing from other fields of hybridization.
We saw that move from the plural political sciences, which is just a loose collection of studies, to the singular political science, a declaration of scientific unity.
And that very recent 2018 Polish reform, which merged politics with administration, shows that this identity is still shifting, still expanding, to cover the functional reality of how we are governed in the 21st century.
What really resonates with me is the sheer antiquity of this study. You know, those 17th century chairs in Sweden and Poland. It proves that the human urge to understand and to teach effective governance has always been there, even if the methods have changed from pure philosophy to empirical social science.
That long, long pedigree, which was punctuated by these periods of total suppression and explosive growth, it just underscores the incredible tenacity required for any discipline that dares to study the volatile world of power.
So let's end with that powerful, grand analogy from Carl W. Deutsch. If politology is meant to be a branch of medicine designed to prevent suffering and death in the political body, and if its main patient right now is representative democracy, which is clearly suffering from decay, polarization, and a loss of trust, what specific treatment drawing from this vast hybridized knowledge should political scientists be prescribing?
Well, the prescription can't be a single pill. It has to be systemic. It would demand the kind of deep comparative analysis that the behavioral school championed. Looking at what specific institutional arrangements, maybe it's electoral reform, maybe it's different constitutional checks, have proven more resistant to this decay in other democracies.
So it's about moving beyond the day-to-day partisan shouting.
It has to be. It's about applying those prognostic models to suggest what might be painful but necessary institutional surgery to restore the health of the system before the sickness becomes terminal. That, I think, is the high calling of the politologist today.
That's a fascinating, and I have to say, pretty urgent call to action. Thank you for guiding us through this complex history.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.